Hi, thanks a million everybody for coming out on this pretty bleak summer evening. We hoped to offer you some good weather, but it wasn't in our gift. I'd like you to welcome Cian O'Callaghan. He's our deputy leader of the party and our housing spokesperson. And just to say, we've been very proud of the work Cian's been doing lately. I think he's been doing an absolutely fantastic job. So what we'd like to do is kind of have a conversation. We've got a couple of questions, and then we'd like to open the floor to questions. So please feel free to write in any questions you might have, and then we'll come to you. We'd like to use the session to have half of the time just a discussion with ourselves, if that's okay with you, Cian. And then we'd like to open that up to the floor. So welcome again, and here's to Cian O'Callaghan. So if you're ready, I'd like to start. So basically, opinion polls are showing that housing is the #1 issue for most voters. Not a day goes past where we don't hear about it on the radio or on the news or with our constituency work. Not a financial demographic is not impacted by the housing crisis. So homelessness has reached record levels. Rents have reached levels, and the numbers of young adults stuck living in their childhood homes has been estimated about 250,000 people. People who are couch surfing are not counted in the homeless figures. People who are living at home are not counted in the homeless figures. And I think people on housing assistance payment are not counted on the housing list. So we're not even recording the scale of the crisis appropriately. So my question is, why has the housing situation deteriorated so rapidly over the last number of years? And if you'd like to address that, Cian, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nuala, and very nice to see everyone. Is the sound of that about right then for people at the back? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I mean, firstly, I think the first thing saying, I think, look, there's a few reasons why things have gotten so bad in the last few years on housing, but the very first thing I think to say in that is, I think it's important that we're always very conscious that people who are at the sharp end of this housing crisis have been at the sharp end of housing crises before the last number of years. So we have always had, and for a long time we've had, for people with disabilities, for members of the travelling community. If you look at youth homelessness, there's been overrepresentation consistently of LGBTI young people, especially trans people in youth homelessness. Migrants, when you look at some of the exploitation in the rental sector in particular, it does affect everyone, but it particularly affects migrants, people who are more vulnerable, people who have less support networks. So people who are at the sharp end of housing, in a lot of ways, none of this is new. Yes, it's worse, and it's affecting them. It's affecting them worse. It's obviously affecting everyone at this stage. I think, look, there's a few elements on it. I think the decision, effectively, the informal decision to stop building social housing that was taken was a disaster and proven to be a disaster. I think that happened for a few reasons, so that there was that move away from building social housing. Look, there was, you saw in the 1980s in the UK, you saw with Thatcher this kind of, move towards selling and privatising the social housing stock. That had an impact here. I think you saw here in the mid-80s with the surrender grants, where people who are in social housing were given a grant of, I think it was about £5,000 to leave their social housing dwelling so they could buy a private dwelling. And that was a well-intended policy to try and free up social homes for other people who might need it, but it actually had a really disastrous impact, I think, on social housing. It meant that some of the people in communities who were community leaders, who were holding those communities together, who were liaising with Gardaí, lobbying politicians, who were running the Scouts, were given an incentive effectively to move out of those communities. And Niamh Hurricane, in her book Understanding Limerick, goes through in very good detail how she feels that affected communities in Limerick, and she would argue that they never recovered from that measure in terms of the decimation it had to community leadership, and then the knock-on impact that had on social housing, and effectively kind of giving social housing, a negative image, whereas up until then it had quite a positive image, especially in Ireland, in terms of how it helped to lift people out of slums and lift people out of poverty. I think one of the other things that has gotten us where we are now, you could call it over-reliance in the private sector. Often talk about social housing, reliance on HAP or very expensive, bad value deals like long-term leasing, or if you look recently at the recent government announcements on cost rental, we're the only country in Europe where cost rental, which is meant to be affordable rental housing provided at the cost it takes to provide it, because it's meant to be done on a not-for-profit basis. We're the only country in Europe where within a few years of introducing that, there's already these large subsidies being introduced, and they're being given to the private sector to provide affordable rental housing. Now, you might kind of go, who cares whether it's private sector, not-for-profit sector that delivers it? Makes a massive difference on the rents that would be charged. Not only does the private sector have to get a profit from their venture, private sector, to build housing, it costs them more because they have to pay higher interest rates. It's a speculative model. So even in terms of affordable housing, our governments have managed to skew it in an expensive, speculative, high-risk, high financing cost method of delivery. So you could call that over-reliance in the private sector. You could call it, if you prefer, neoliberalism. You could call it, if you prefer, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. It's all really kind of the same. It is kind of the same thing. And it's actually a disastrous approach to housing. Any of the initiatives on their own, if you look at them in isolation, aren't necessarily on their own terribly destructive. It's the cumulative approach of a whole range of initiatives that are about developers, subsidies, inflating house prices that have partially led us to where we are. And then I think a third issue, certainly in terms of how things have gotten worse, is around the economic collapse, which of course was fueled by initiatives to stimulate private sector involvement in the housing sector, the Section 23 tax reliefs that really were part of the reason that we had partially led to the collapse we had, because we had an overstimulated housing sector. We'd, in a financial sense, it was being overstimulated. So the banks did play, I think, when the banks entered the mortgage system in the 80s, that you saw then, you saw house prices beginning to inflate as all that extra finance came in. Certainly when we joined the euro, there was extra finance and low-cost finance coming in. I remember when I was a student and I had no income of any sort at one stage, I had a bank account and I got a letter offering me a loan for 10,000 euro on anything I wanted. I had to buy a car, build a house extension. And I mean, that was the approach the banks were taking at the moment. They were flooding the system with credit after we joined the euro, and that wasn't properly regulated. And then since the crash, of course, the banks aren't lending for builders, which makes financing of projects very difficult for builders. It means then, of course, there's the investment funds, the REITs have been attracted in as an alternative. And there's been a real deficit. Dara Turnbull in Housing Europe has written about this recently. Real deficit in Ireland of us going after alternative non-commercial financing streams. There's very good examples around Europe of where that's done. There's a whole load of European Union funds that we, Horizon funding and so forth, that we could be drawing down to try and pay for retrofitting of housing and so forth, that the government's kind of been negligent on. So look, there's a lot of different factors, but I think there's some of them.
You've got such a comprehensive knowledge of the sector. Thank you so much. And while you were talking, I was trying to think of, because we're the left bank, I was trying to think of words beginning with L, didn't get to B, that really kind of, so the huge problem areas are leasing, land hoarding, the lists not reflecting the need adequately, and then loans, the affordability of mortgages, and then obviously the government grants bringing up the prices in the private sector. And so really a lot of people are kind of despairing when it comes to housing and their future prospects and how they're going to get on the housing ladder or even find a place to rent within the same county or the same area that they want to live and work. So what can we say to give those people hope tonight?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a narrative the whole time from the government, not just in housing, but you can see it particularly in housing. And there's this kind of narrative of, housing's bad in Ireland, but sure, it's bad all over the world. And, when Varadkar is asked about, young people emigrating because they cannot find somewhere affordable to live here and we're losing their skills, he kind of says, the grass, they're not going to find the grass greener anywhere else. Sure, rents are are high in other places, even though Dublin's pretty much the most expensive city in the European Union to rent in. Since Fine Gael have taken office, of course, that wasn't the case 10 years ago. We've had this narrative of, like, he's actually was normalising a couple of years ago the homelessness levels, trying to say this is normal to have homelessness. There's a narrative now around homelessness where they start saying, oh, well, the reason there's homelessness is this, trying to put the blame on people who are homeless and saying, oh, well, they've complex needs and, oh, and sure, by the way, it happens when relationships break down. And yes, that is factors in homelessness. It doesn't mean you are going to, in any society, unfortunately, you're going to have relationships breaking down and you're going to have people with addiction, unfortunately. And it's how you deal with that and how you support people in those situations that matters. And it's not their fault that homelessness has reached record levels since Fine Gael have taken office. So trying to push that narrative, I think, is really, really cynical. So I do think we need to, you know, governments, right-wing governments always push that thing of there is no alternative. Sure, things can't get any better. Oh, it's got nothing to do with us. These are just facts of life, by the way. Like, you know, can you not see there's housing problems in other countries? Why are you complaining? So they always push that, you know, there is no alternative. And I think it's our job to give people hope and show people there are good examples of how these things are dealt with. So, look, there's great examples all over Europe. You know, look at Finland, where they pretty much eradicated rough sleeping. Finland, I think, is one of the countries as well where they've very small numbers of adults in their late 20s still living at home, incidentally, as well. And, you know, look at the Netherlands, and not maybe so much in more recent years when you've had more right-wing governments, but the Netherlands was incredibly good with land management. They used to, the state and the local authorities used to just buy up land, put in the infrastructure, decide we're going to have some affordable housing here, some student housing here, some housing for older people here, we're going to have social housing here, we're going to do the affordable rental here, we're going to put in the playground, put in the community centre, put in the school, put in all the infrastructure, community infrastructure, and not wait for the market to do that, or not wait for someone to speculatively buy up farmland and then get it rezoned in Ireland and make a killing, you know. So they did really, really good land management. No reason we couldn't do that. The Kenny report, after all, in Ireland spelled that out before I was alive, anyway. And actually, when the Kenny report was spelling that out, there hadn't been the sort of land speculation that we now we now see, and we're now paying the price for. So we need to give people examples from across Europe to give them hope as to how things can be done better. But actually, I think more importantly, and I find, look, when I'm out knocking on doors and I meet people who've lived in other European countries, they really get that. They really get that public services could be an awful lot better because they've got direct experience of it. But look, for people who haven't maybe lived in other European countries, don't have that direct experience, sometimes that can all sound a bit, oh, but sure, look, they have a better culture in the Netherlands, we couldn't do that here or whatever. So the best way to hammer home the point in Ireland is to actually talk about what's happened in Ireland. Did we have a housing crisis in Ireland before? We absolutely did. I have here the 1914 report into housing conditions of the working classes in the city of Dublin. It was actually a report given to the House of Commons. Goes through the slum conditions, tenement conditions in Dublin, compares Dublin to other cities that were you know, in England and Scotland, shows that the conditions in Dublin were way worse. You had more families in slums and tenements in Dublin than anywhere else, and much more in terms of wooden bed tenements. You'd much more overcrowding there in Dublin than anywhere else. And I mention that because, you know, 100 years ago in Ireland, the housing conditions were absolutely and utterly appalling, and what we did to address them. And we can make massive criticisms, I think, of failings of the Irish state and failings to develop public services and equality and inclusion. But actually one area that we really didn't fail and we did incredible, it wasn't perfect, but we did incredible as a country on, was on housing. And we should be aware of that, and we should be reminding people about that we were able to do that as a country when we didn't have a lot of resources. Conditions were so bad in housing, it wasn't even a housing issue, it was a public health issue. And that's when the slums were starting to be cleared. The first Some clearances were happening around the Coombe in the 1870s. I think one of the second schemes was in Plunkett Street, and the corporation bought the slums, cleared them, and then sold them, leased them in a long-term lease, 10,000 years for £200 a year to the Dublin Arsons Dwelling Company, who then built cottages, some 2-storey housings and some 3 stories with the shops on the ground floor. And they did a revolutionary thing in that Plunkett Street scheme, which is that they put locks on the front doors of the houses. Now, there was no TVs or anything to be nicked out of the houses, and putting locks on houses wasn't really a thing back then. Anyone know why they put locks on the houses in Plunkett Street? Wasn't much to steal, and there was always someone at home. The reason they put locks on the front door is because the conditions, the public health conditions had been so bad up until then. One of the problems in tenement buildings, you'd have one toilet used, forgive me, by about 100 people in terrible conditions. And it was just normal practice then, if you're walking down the street and you want to use the toilet, you just walk into a house and use the toilet, even though it was in terrible condition. So the locks were put in the front door to stop a randomer walking by your house and just going in and helping themselves to the toilets in a public health sense to try and improve things. And sorry for that aside as such, but when Ireland 100 years ago, when we started as a country, we had very few resources. If you think the city centre, it had to be rebuilt, O'Connell Street had to be rebuilt. But one of the very first things we started to do was build public housing. In my constituency, Marino was built as affordable purchase. It was an incredibly successful scheme. You knock on doors in Marino now, and the community is very cohesive. It's built around greens. You meet people there, and they say, my grandparents lived here and bought the house 100 years ago, and the family's always lived here since. There's new generations moved in, older residents, younger families, they all get on well, really well designed, based on the kind of garden cities model. And that was done when the country had very little resources and was trying to rebuild after a civil war. We were able to do these things. In my constituency, and sometimes people kind of give out to me for referring to newlyweds draw, I'm not proposing a modern version of housing just for newlyweds or anything like that. But in Donamead, when you talk to people in my constituency, they will tell you they bought the house 50 years ago, that they were in their early 20s, they were renting for a couple of years to save up a deposit. They entered a thing in the Mansion House called a newlyweds draw to give younger people a chance to buy a home, and that's how they got their first affordable purchase house, and they've lived there ever since, and their kids were able to get involved in the community and thrive as a result of the stability that gave them. And so we were able to do these things as a country when we had very little resources. We cleared slums, got people out of terrible housing, the kind of housing that was built in Crumlin and Ballyfermot, all across the country, was revolutionary at the time. Was people going from terrible conditions to these 3-bed houses with a front garden, back garden, clean air. The complaint in Crumlin was the air is clean and our kids are hungry as a result. And literally some people, because they were used to the air being so unclean and all the rest, and didn't like the conditions, and also because the breakdown in community, and there wasn't consultation with people in a way. They were thrown out into new communities. They weren't consulted about it. Things like bus fares were very expensive for people. So actually a significant number of people actually moved back into tenements because that was kind of done badly. It wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary. And just finally to say, I mean, outside of that, what was done on terms of land, we were, there was one proper land survey ever done in Ireland, 1872, and that showed that every single inch of land in Ireland was owned by 1.3% of the population. Everybody else didn't own land. We had a huge amount of renting. In rural areas, people were renting, working the farmland. And what we don't often talk about in Ireland is the Land Commission. I was talking to an academic in UCD recently who's got great knowledge about, public policy and all the rest. He never even heard of the Land Commission. And what the Land Commission did is it legally transferred, by buying out the land from the estates, legally transferred 85 to 95% of land in Ireland to farmers, to people who had been renting their dwellings. And it was a massive redistribution of wealth and resources, and particularly in rural areas. And we don't even talk about that we did these things. The records of the Land Commission are sitting in a warehouse, 8 million of them, down in Portlaoise with no public access or archival access. And these are the kind of things that, I say these things because we need to remind people that in difficult circumstances, we did huge things in housing that massively improved people's lives. Wasn't perfect, could have been more. And if we're able to do those in those difficult circumstances, we can certainly do it now when we have more resources.
And I totally agree with you about the Land Commission. My cousin's granny was actually moved from Kerry up to did the Land Commission, and so did a lot of people that they lived with. And then talking about things that they did in the 1870s, Arthur Guinness is from Leixlip and set up his first brewery there. And actually he was an advocate for building housing for his workers and healthcare for his workers, and from a social kind of context. But actually to have healthy workers that keep coming back to work, they need places to live. Do you know what I mean? And I think we are in danger if policies don't change of going back to the 1913, 16, those kind of housing crises. And in general, I do think the governments do have a punch-down approach. They like to blame people. But I think in Ireland we're seeing that people from it doesn't matter what your background is, what your working history is, people cannot find housing on any level. So it's not the line that, oh, there's something wrong with your approach to finding yourself some housing doesn't work anymore. So I know you've introduced lots of good pieces of legislation and made some really good suggestions to the government, and they've just chosen not to accept them because that's not their ideology. But what I really want to ask is, what would the Social Democrats do if or when we're in government to fix the housing situation, or what could be achieved over one 5-year term in government?
Yeah, so it's a long list of things, so I won't keep you for the full hour, listening, but just give you a few things that I think need to be done, and if we're in government, have to be done. So if you wanted to take one measure as a government to reduce the number of people who are becoming homeless, what you would do is you would bring Ireland into line with most European countries where renters who pay their rent aren't evicted. So the norm in most countries is you pay your rent to the landlord, they don't evict you. They want to sell the house, apartment, that's fine, they sell it. You stay there, it's your home. You change the bank account that you pay into, and that's it. And the biggest driver of people becoming homeless at the moment is when they're losing a tenancy in the private rental sector. And the biggest driver of people losing tenancies in the private rental sector at the moment is sales of homes. So there's just one measure you want to do. Certainly won't be popular with everyone, it would be controversial, but I think once you do it, after a while, people get used to it. And we're in a situation, our rented sector has grown very fast in Ireland, and the larger rental sectors in Europe all have bedded in proper rent regulation for the whole rental sector, not just for the rent pressure zones, and they have good security of tenure for renters. So the countries like Germany, Switzerland with large rental sectors, that's what they have. That's what a mature rental sector looks like. So we've been growing our rental sector, but not growing the security and protection for renters. So we're getting the worst of both worlds, people not getting the kind of long-term security from a long-term social housing tenancy or from owning a home, but more and more people being in a rented sector with low levels of security. So you wanted to do one thing to reduce the amount of people becoming homeless, that would be it. That would obviously buy you some time then as you build up your social housing stock. Obviously would be a benefit to renters as well, would take away that horrible fear of what's going to happen. My kids are in school, if I get a notice to quit, what's going to happen to me? And it's just considered fair in other countries that it is considered, if you're renting, that is meant to be your home. Yes, someone else might own the property, but it's your home and your rights go with that. In fact, the debate in other European countries isn't around that. It's about how do you support renters who maybe fall behind in their rent so they can stay in their home. That's actually where the debate and the discussion is. It's never about, well, let's have these really wide grounds to evict people who've always been paying their rent. Just doesn't happen in most. I think there's a huge amount that we could do, in terms of social housing, affordable rental, and also affordable purchase. So Cllr, for example, on the affordable purchase side, shown you can build homes, A2, high-quality 3-bed houses, and sell them for €260,000 with the right supports. That can be done, but it's been done on a very small scale. That could be rolled out. There's issues around infrastructure, early stage finance that could be done that would help support that. And then look, there's a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of land management. I was touching on it earlier. But not like, for example, having a land development agency that doesn't have compulsory purchase powers is off the wall. I mean, the whole idea of land assembly and land strategic assembly is you have those CPO powers. They don't always have to be used. You can approach landowners, offer to buy. If they won't play ball, then you can CPO. But to have a strategic land assembly initiative in the country without those CPO powers makes no sense. And again, I don't want to be overly historic, but you go back to the reason you can walk down O'Callaghan Street and it's a wide boulevard and all the rest is because there were CPO powers for the Wide Streets Commission 150 odd years ago. It was, if you could do that back then, how on earth with a housing crisis now can you not give proper CPO powers to buy up land as it's needed? The key in that is, I was talking about Marino earlier. Marino, the cost per house of the land in Marino was about £11. The build cost was about, in the first phase of it, was about £560. Now, there's pretty much no housing scheme now where the land cost wouldn't be between 10 or 20% of the final cost of the home. So if you think of that, it was a tiny fraction of the final cost back then. The first 260 homes were bought on a bit of land, I think bought for about £5,000. Yes, there's been inflation, but inflation doesn't bring that to millions, and the kind of prices that would be paid now. So we pay massively over the odds for land. It's obviously hoarded, it's speculated. Then the cost of putting your infrastructure in that land. When there's a school site reserved, the Department of Education then is paying top price for that school site that's been reserved, rather than the state or local authority CPOing it all at agricultural price, and then leaving a site aside for your school to go in or your community centre or whatever. So just none of that makes sense. Land speculation shouldn't be rewarded. It's not. I respect people who build homes. I respect builders. I respect the labourers and that. They're putting in work. They should get a return for that. Why should a land speculator, when other countries are able to produce housing without land speculators, why should they be rewarded? Makes no sense.
And so leave us with one thing in the first 5 years that you would hope to achieve.
I think the very first test of any government, social democrats from government, any progressive government, has to be to reduce homelessness. So if that's day number one, it has to be measures on that. I think, but what you would want to see over time is over a few years, is you'd want to see that 68% of people in their late 20s living in their childhood bedrooms. You want to see that starting to go in the right direction and quickly. And I certainly know around the constituency, that is affecting people's well-being, their mental health, their development. And it is ripping up the unwritten kind of social contract that everyone felt that they had, that you participate in society, you do your best, you can live an independent life. That's not a huge amount to ask for.
And I think talking to constituents as well, it's the single most talked about issue, whereas in the general election 16, it was about 20% of people were talking about it. In 2020, it might have been 30 or 40%, and now it's like 90% of people. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Cian. We think you're doing a brilliant job. We're really proud of you. I'd like to open to the floor for Q&A, if that's okay with people. If you wanted to put your hand up, I think somebody's going to go around with a microphone. Our trusty helpers, many. And so what I'd like to do is take a couple of questions. I don't know who so Rory's going to be our question. Do you want to start at the back and work your way forward? Is that okay, Rory? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nick. I live in Sandymount. A report from Trinity University recently assessed that the way that planning works in Ireland is incentivizing the rising cost of homes and the unavailability of homes. So my question to you would be, do you agree with that assessment? And secondly, how would we as Social Democrats change the planning system to advanced housing availability. Thank you.
And I'll take another few questions as well.
Hello, Nuala.
Hi, love. How are
sorry,
you?
Declan from Kildare North. Apologies, I missed the earlier part of your meeting, so I might be going backtracking.
And you're going to answer the question that was just asked, aren't you?
No.
No. Okay.
This year, 2023, is the 50th anniversary of the Kenny Report, which was commissioned by Fianna Fáil back in 1972 and reported to Fine Gael Labour government in 1973. And the essence of the recommendations from that report was that the government should compulsory purchase order land at current usage value plus 25%.
Yeah.
I'm in Leixlip, Maynooth, Selbridge area, and agricultural land there and Leinster generally sells for about 16,000 an acre. So 16 plus 25% is 20,000 euro an acre. Rezone it 1.2 million. Now that is extortionate and unjust and immoral to the extreme, and it doesn't seem to be featuring anywhere as a red line issue. Now we did bring it up. I brought it up at the last year's Social Democrat National Conference, and it did go into the agenda to say that you guys would report it. So the question I have is, will it be a red line issue to go into government that the Kenny report is implemented? Will it be a red line issue for the Social Democrats to go into government?
We'll come back to that one. I want to take a few questions together so that we allow as many people as possible to have their say.
How you doing? Gareth Mullen is my name. I'm also a housing officer with Respond Housing Association, so I have some interest in this area. I have two questions. One is in relation to the modular housing, which failed on initial rollout a number of years ago after the death of Jonathan Curry, but recently it seems that what they're developing for Ukrainians seems to be good quality, long-lasting, cheap, fast-build housing. Is it potentially a game changer in delivering cost rental accommodation at rents that are affordable, like 600 and 700 euro per month, or instead of what could be cost rental over the next couple of years, which would be in some estates of 1,400, 1,500 euro for cost rental properties? The other question I have is, what's a fair social rent? There's a differential rent scheme that applies for social housing, and in South Dublin Council your rent will be based on 10% of your net income. In Meath County Council it's based on a rent differential of 25% of your net income, and in other counties it's at different rates in between those amounts. So what's a fair social rent?
Let me just take a couple of them. I'm going to answer the one on the differential rent scheme. I think with the Kenny report, I think Cian will probably address that. We might not be able to talk about red line issues because sometimes these things are recorded or whatever. So that's not why we're here today. But I think that we did adopt it. Sorry, my microphone's not working properly. We did adopt it at one of our conferences, and it is something that I'm from Leixlip as well. I know Declan quite well. It is something that we would, on Kildare County Council, there's 4 Social Democrats councillors, we would have had to fight against variations, against land hoardings, against zonings. It's in all of the key growth counties. It's a huge issue, and it's something that obviously we'll address. But I wanted to just address the fair social rent question, because the differential rent scheme applies. I'm going to go down a tiny rabbit hole here. It applies if you're already in social housing, in permanent social housing. It doesn't apply if you're not on social housing. So I think the problem is that once you're allocated permanent social housing, your earnings can go up, but there's the maximum income limits, which limits how many people are eligible for social housing, which have been increased in the Kildare and Dublin areas to 40,000 euro after tax, which seems like a lot, but it's not a lot if you've 2 people in the house working, which is what is necessary to kind of maintain a basic rental and you know, cover all the top-ups and everything everybody has to pay. So what is a fair rent really is based on under Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil what the market has decided and what they've allowed for the market to decide. So 6 years ago, it was half of what it is now. So I'll allow Cian, sorry, I just wanted to go down that rabbit hole. I'll allow Cian to answer the question.
Thanks. Yeah, and just on differential rents, I mean, ideally, yes, it would be the same across local authorities around the country, the same sort of, I think it's arbitrary at the moment, and really the intention generally is to get to that point, but it's quite hard to do that in terms of, in terms of that aligning and obviously the difficulties that would cause some. In relation, and Gareth, just in relation to modular housing, is it a game changer? So absolutely is something that we need to be doing more of. You can do very high quality modular build or off-site construction, no question about it. Like, it's presented as kind of new, it's not, it's been around at least since post World War II times. Yes, the technology has improved. It's not right now if you start using more modular, are you going to get from rents of $1,500 a month to $600 or $700 a month? At the moment, it's not particularly cheaper. There's not enough scale. There's the whole industry there saying they need confidence to be able to scale up. But look, it means you can use more environmentally friendly material. Look, there's a lot of high quality buildings across the country that are built that are modular construction that people don't even realise are modular construction. So certainly the quality can be done. In relation to the Kenny report, I did, when I was talking about if we were in government, what would we want to do, and I said about land and about CPO powers and about stopping land speculation. I think if we were in government and we didn't do that, and we didn't try and do the Kenny report or what was done in the Netherlands, or something around land management to stop the speculative part, we'd be doing a massive injustice. That would be the long-term thing we could do to make housing for everyone more affordable, if we could cut out land speculation. And it means we could get the infrastructure in that we need for thriving, healthy communities where people want to live and want to stay and want to grow old in. So I think that's absolutely key. It's the reform around land is the kind of stuff that we need to do for ourselves as a country for the future. It's not the kind of thing that's going to get you a quick turnaround in terms of, let's say, homes numbers or anything like that. It's what we need to do and bed in for the long term. If we left government and hadn't done that, the long-term reform in housing that needed to be done isn't done. I think it's absolutely critical. But you have to be taking immediate measures as well, because the housing situation is so desperate for so many people. In terms, and just to give you one example, Kildare County Council, for example, when they were in at the Oireachtas Housing Committee, were telling us they couldn't bid for development land in their own area. They're being outbid by all the private developers. And you're like, why are they trying to bid for development land? Why aren't they CPOing agricultural land, buying it up, building up a land bank? The Department of Housing won't finance them to buy agricultural land and build up a land bank. They'll only finance them to buy land that's ready to go at high speculative prices. And just on planning and what needs to be done, is planning, look, if we want to be serious about planning, we need to invest in forward planning. We haven't done that well as a country. And if you do that and you do that well, then you get your infrastructure, you get your thriving communities, you can actually be, it can make housing more affordable by identifying land and getting the infrastructure in with it and all that sort of stuff. I think there's a bit of a narrative from developers of planning is all the problem, but bear in mind, for example, in the city at the moment, there's planning permission for 50,000 apartments on serviced land with infrastructure that haven't been commenced and aren't being initiated or worked on. So there can be a bit of a narrative of the planning system's to blame. Yes, it could be more efficient, but if you want to get rid of the conflict in the planning system, we've a lot, means investing in forward planning and getting more engagement at an early stage rather than that kind of conflict that follows thereafter.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, everybody. I'm really, really sorry. The boss has told me we have to wrap it up. We could talk about housing. We could spend the whole 2 days of the summer school talking about housing. I do want to hear your questions, though. So if you do have questions, I did see a few hands go up. Do write them down, pass them to us. Give us an email address. We will definitely get back to you. It's a massive topic. We've loved engaging with you on the topic, and thank you so much for coming to our talk.